but it's there. People can watch it on YouTube or however. All of these things somehow manage their way into YouTube. And anyway, I'm going to try and get these slides on the screen. So you guys be patient with me.
Take your time, no problem.
Okay, I'm going to try and do this. Let's see. So I got Boink. Host disabled attendees screen sharing. So it says I got to be able to do that. Let's see again. Now it says you guys won't let me screen share.
Why, Yazan? Let's see. Wait a second. Let's make sure that everything is all right.
Let's see. Well, I don't know what.
It's working or not? It doesn't seem to work. What is the message that comes on the screen?
Yeah, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay, we'll contact them as fast as we can.
Okay, let's see what happens. I'm trying again. So now I need to
We have activated the share screen. Please.
There it is. There. Now I got it.
Thank you.
Thank you. File. I got it. Just a minute. Well, I was just going to have to do, let's see, well, I thought we had rehearsed this and I was able to get it. Erdy, what am I supposed to do?
Where's it? Yes.
After you press on share screen, please click on your window that you want to share.
Yes.
Erdi is with us or not, Erdi?
No, I can't. We had it before. The same guys aren't with me, so I don't know.
No problem.
What it appears in your window?
Yes.
Let me see. Okay, here we go. How about that? There's full screen.
Still didn't work. Let's see. Still didn't work.
I got the full screen now.
Okay, if you want, you can press the escape button. I think it will work. It will get you out of full screen on the keyboard. There is the escape button on top left. Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to get that.
Dr. Peter, please open screen. It's green, yeah. Okay, press on share screen.
I'm gonna, yeah, right now,
Yeah, it will appear a window and you have to choose one of the windows that you want to share.
Yeah, I'm trying to see where share screen is. I don't
The share screen is in the bottom of the screen. And
Bottom
it's
right.
green.
It says Zoom phone meetings and sharing. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Now, I got writing, screen sharing, share your screen.
Didn't you find the share screen? It's in the bottom of the screen.
Any way that you can see the screen.
Yeah, I know.
Simply select share screen. Okay.
Okay, it works.
Yeah. From here, you'll be given various options.
Okay,
Such as
All
let's,
right.
let's see if that works.
It's working now. Yes.
Okay, so this is a project. Let's see, how do I move it forward?
Okay. When you're ready, select share. Again. Stop the share. To stop sharing,
Okay.
Not start while the other participant is share. Okay,
take a moment to
Okay. Is someone sharing their
I
screen?
need to do the next slide. That's I can't move it. Doesn't move.
You can move by scroll mouse, the mouse by the mouse.
Okay, I'm trying to move by.
If you need to go back to screen sharing mode first.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Now,
It's fine.
yes, with the mouse, I think it's going to work.
Okay.
Scrolling down.
There you go. But I can't get the whole. I gotta.
The full screen.
No, it's Zoom, not full screen.
Then Apple Expert. Okay. Are you trying to make a full screen?
Yeah, I'm trying to make a screen and I can't get the thing that was before.
Peter, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, could you go up to the window, like all the way up
Right.
to the left corner?
Yeah.
You will see view there,
We will see what?
like file, view.
Yeah, file. Yeah.
Click on view. Okay, click on view.
Click on what?
No. Go up
On
to the
file, view,
yeah, view.
on
Okay,
view,
slideshow all the way down.
slideshow. Okay, got it. Okay,
And
got it.
then go to the third icon from the right.
Third icon from the right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Cool.
that's it. And then it'll go, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
This is an aerial view of the context. Our building is right here, the gray building. It's halfway between the Momo and the School of Architecture. The circle is where the plaza, it's a triangular site. The School of Architecture is over here, and the Duomo is down on the lower left. And this was a site we were given. We won it in a competition against Gregati. And we looked around at Milan housing types. And this is one of the famous projects of the 1920s by a Milanese architect called Giovanni Muzio. It's called the Ca Bruta, that is beautiful house, I mean brutal house, because the Italians didn't like it at all when it was built. It was too radical for 1922. But the thing that I liked about it, and I thought was really important, was the striation of the different stones. There were 3 different levels conforming to the base, to the piano nobile in this darker gray, and to the attic story, the Renaissance idea of the tripartite facade. And so we decided we were going to do a similar kind of idea, like none of the present day buildings do anything like this. Anyway, another important thing for us was the way Muzio handled the corner site in this very strange, and you can see there's a division between his building and another building on this lower end of the site. And the scale of the window openings, the scale and the tripartite disposition of organization on the facade was very important. So Muzio was a precedent that we thought was really important. The problem was, this is the mass of the site. We did a series of diagrammatic studies. There is an existing building at this lower corner here, the white area, where we couldn't build. And there were all sorts of restrictions. We needed to get 85 units in order to make it work for a developer. And we couldn't build this. It violated all kinds of light and air restrictions. So what you're going to see is a series of diagrams. So we had to have this. You see the arrows. We had to have this amount of distance. So we had to cut this corner away. Then we had to move the block on the northeast side in, because we couldn't have that height. We were limited in height in any case because we were in the flight path of the city airport, Linate. So we started to get something like this. And it was a very rational way of working. We had to set back again for height and mass requirements from the corner. We had to have this dimensional gap here. We had to set back over here. So we ended up with a building envelope in number 6 drawing that didn't look like anything. It was just nothing. And so we decided to join the 6 and the 2 pieces and produce 1 piece. And you can see the form that it took. And then we went to a smooth surface. I've never done a curvy building before. It's not something I wanted to do, but it was something that was necessary to get the units in the project. The second thing that we decided that we wanted to do in the organization was to have no corridors. And so what we did was have, you can see the darkness. The dark areas are 6 elevator cores, which go from the bottom to the top, so that you get an apartment on either side on each floor. So we have 9 floors times 2 is 18 times 5 is 90 possible units. Then you take out the 5 that are for the existing building and you get 85 units. And so because we had no corridors and did the elevators, yes, were a little more expensive, but you had the kind of privacy with only one other tenant on either side of your elevator corridor. So we were very pleased with that. And here you can see the development vertically. we had the base was going to be a certain kind of Roman sandstone, a sort of yellowish color. There was going to be the piano nobile, which was going to be gray, and then there was going to be a top area which was going to be white marble, so you can see in the layout how it sits on the site, and it receives a garden, a public garden here, which extends across our site into a private garden, a public garden on the site. Another advantage that we were thinking about, in addition to doing architecture, was that we wanted to have through ventilation. In other words, that we didn't need air conditioning because we could save on electric power, because each apartment has windows on either side. Some have the public spaces on the right side, some have it on the left side, but the other compensatory bedrooms and things open so that there's through air on each floor. Here you can see a typical floor plan, and what you'll notice also is that here are the cores that you can see, six cores, an apartment and an apartment and an apartment, and each apartment has not only through air but has a terrace. So on this level, the terrace is on the inboard side, and then there'll be terraces on the outboard side. So there's the structure that we came up with to solve housing accommodation. And then you can see at the piano nobile, there are terraces on the outboard side of the project. Again, the plans. The section. Now, what's important about the section is I always believe that there are fronts and backs to buildings. If you look at Renaissance buildings, the fronts of buildings are articulated and the backs, the fronts are flat, the backs articulated. And so what we needed was a way of articulating the project. So the base is 3 levels here. There's the piano nobile level here, which is set in and has terraces on the back side, these terraces on the front side. And then the attic story protrudes on the front. So there's a play between the front and the back. There's a shift of the volume through the structure. And that's why on the top you begin to see the structure appearing, steel and aluminum square shapes that take up where the volume has been moved. And that's why you're going to see not only different color stone, different location for the stone, but also the structure begins to reveal itself. And so here you see in the rendering, you got what will be a brownish sandstone at the lower level, piano nobile, which is basically glass, and then marble floors on top, which because of its movement reveals this grid. And you can see the grid revealed on the front more than the back. It's pushed through the back side onto the front side. So those are the drawings, and There you can see from the outboard corner, here's that public open space. You can see the Roman sandstone is a yellowish color here. The piano nobile is more of a open and glazed, and then the white marble is on top with the projection through of the grid. So it peels away because these are urban houses, 3 stories, some of them 2 stories, and single story with large outdoor terraces. So actually from the upper level here, you can view out over the roofs of Milan, see the Duomo, etc., because most of Milan is just slightly lower than our building. So you get a building that has a contextual reverberation, let's say, with Muzio's Car Bruta, but has a quality of being of today. It's not avant-garde, but it's thoughtful about architecture. And there are a lot of things that one can see that deal with the idea of architecture. So here is the backside of the building, and you'll notice that the grid is pushed into the marble, and you see the reveals in where the grid pushes through to the front. So the front is articulated in a different way than the back, even though the building is the same thickness throughout. It has a different quality in the back than the front. There is the existing building, which we were allowed to build on top of, as long as we didn't touch it and set our building back. And you can see the building as it moves down to the corner at the other side. And here is the existing building, and our building that sits next to it. These are modern Milan housing blocks. And we're very excited with this. It's a very thoughtful, I think, way of putting a building together, trying to pick up precedents from quality building and ideas of building in Milan. And you can see the garden, and it clearly is a new building. Is it modern? Is it postmodern? Is it post-digital? That's a question to think. But right now, it's solved. The apartments are all rented, and I think that's important. And on the basis of this, we're doing another housing project in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. We're doing 2,000 units of market housing coming off of this project. And we're going to be starting that in October. But it's really exciting to take the challenge of the next scale. This is 85 units, and now we're going up to 2,000 units.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Some night shots that were taken. And of course, the light reflects differently on the different color stone and different texture, from a soft stone to a hard stone to metal panels. So it's a very complex facade. The interior of the apartments, of course, we furnished this. It's not the way they would necessarily end up. But you can see they're very light. And there's a axonometric of the different materials in the floor and in this wood paneling and shelving. So you can see how material also becomes important in the organization of signs in the project. Here are some later pictures that were taken by a small drone, which is really interesting. You can really get to see a roofscape now with these drone images. Here's a great shot looking down. So the whole idea of the project is very clear from the drone view. It's like a bird's eye axo. And here you can see the color very clearly playing between the bottom base and piano nobile and attic story. Okay. I wanted to do a half-hour theory, a half-hour building, and we have a half an hour for questions. So
Thank you very much.
Presentation.
Okay.
First of all, it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. We got a lot of questions to ask about the subject within the first part of the lecture and the second part. So we'll start with the question from Yazan here. He told me that one. Yes.
Okay. My question is, although you had mentioned today the term of architecture of resistance and resistance of conception, these concepts are not very clear to us yet, and thus we need further explanation. What exactly they mean. Can you please explain this to us?
What's the word that you want?
If you could explain to us more about what you mentioned in the start of this lecture, the term of architecture of resistance and resistance of.
Oh yeah, resistant. Okay, I think that art throughout the history of art, whether it's architecture, painting and sculpture, music, etc., has always resisted commodification. That is, great art was always outside of the marketplace, whether it was painting or music, opera, etc. It was another issue. It defines for me not the market so much, but the culture, the state of culture. So that I believe if we were to build an Amman, let's say, you would try and make a building that represented the cultural, the aspirations of the culture of Amman. And those aspirations are not just in mere building, but are in architecture, which is another form of resistance to consumption. In other words, that Amman wants to, or any capital city wants to be known for its resistance to commodification and culture. And I think that's the idea of the idealist strain in what I would call democracy, which is that's what I mean. And what I believe is that while my building solves problems that a developer has to make money is out in Milan today and related to Milan in 1920, 100 years ago. And so it relates to the idea of Milan, the ideal of Milan, rather than to consumption of imagery. So it resists consumption. At the same time, it produces another kind of imagery. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for your explanation.
Thank you, thank you. Based on your answer, Mr. Peter, in one of your interviews, you mentioned that you don't really enjoy designing houses where the serve and the served do control the progression of the design. And in another, you mentioned that you don't enjoy working elevations. It is very interesting how you dealt with this both here in this project. What we can learn from your experience, is it the context or is it the president?
Well, first of all, at one point in my career, going back to when I was just doing houses, I thought that that's what I wanted to do. But what I realized was the house, while it solved a lot of architectural ideas culturally and could be a resistant form, was too small a scale. Mm-hmm. You needed to deal with scale, that is, with the urban. And so what I'm interested most in is projects that deal with the urban but are individual buildings, whether it's a concert hall, a school, a mosque, whatever. I think those individual buildings affect a larger scale. The house doesn't do that. So I think that culturally, that certain buildings can be resistant and others not. And I would have thought that the project we did in Milan is a perfect in-between scale, that you couldn't build that scale in New York because the cost of the land is so much that you have to build high. What would happen if Peter Eisenman did a high rise? I don't know. I've projected several high rises that haven't gotten built because they may have been too costly or whatever. But it's a challenging project, the high rise. But the scale, to me, there are two things that in architecture that are not in the other arts. The ground, in other words, you've got to deal with the land, and you have to deal with the scale. And these are two important issues that affect any architecture, whether it's a small cabin or it's a skyscraper. One has to deal with the context, that is the ground. One has to deal with the scale relation to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I got it. Also, I wanted to ask you something, but based on comparison between two projects of yours. This one here and the one you did in Istanbul, the Yenikapi project.
Yes.
In that project, I noticed that you used the ordering system of Hagia Sophia,
Right.
The walls inside, and the way you maximize the scale of the element inside and how you created this order that holds the entire project. I understood that you use the traditional and historical reference as sort of mathematics to organize the project, and then reflect it in a new way with the new scale and new experience. Looking into this project, the ordering system that you got your inspiration from is actually the building that exists on the side with the stone, the variety in stone in the main facade and the urban situation. Is that right or no?
All right. First of all, every project has to have an organizing scale, grid, etc. Le Corbusier had one, Mies van der Rohe had it, etc. What we wanted to find was one that you wouldn't recognize, but is there. In other words, we went to Sophia, and there's some beautiful rhythms. And the same with this project we're doing in Georgia. We found beautiful symbolic rhythms in Eastern Orthodox churches and fabrics that we used in Georgia. So what we do every time is to study the cultural context to find a grid that's not obvious. It's not a literal translation that no one would know, but it feels very similar to the way you feel in Hagia Sophia. If you're sensitive, you can say that Palladio and Le Corbusier did certain things of a Western organization of space. Hagia Sophia is a completely different idea of space, even though originally it was Christian. It wasn't Western. And so what we did was study that organization of Hagia Sophia to produce the grid in Yenikapi. And then the project in the Milan project comes right out of the 20th century, early 20th century, the grid that we had. And if you go to Georgia, to Tbilisi, and see the project that we're doing, it also is a grid from another culture. And so what's important for young architects in Amman is to study the range of cultural precedents in the architecture in Jordan. Even though it's a new country, it has, in a sense, new. The way of building and thinking that has to come through today in a building in Amman, if it's to be what I would call critical and resistant project.
That, inshallah. Yes, we'll do.
You go ahead. You need to do that.
Yes. We will aim at it, inshallah. It will be a goal. We will work at it. Yazan have a question here also.
Do you believe that when you change the scale of the rhythm and then to recreate it, do you believe that people will feel it?
Do I believe? But people will feel it. They may not know what it is or why, but they know something's happening. All right, that it's not. Somehow it's not easy. It's more difficult. They don't know why it's more difficult. So we can't expect the people to know what architecture is, like you can't expect you and I to know what a virus is. When you go to a doctor, you don't say to the doctor, if he says you've got the virus, you don't say, no, you're wrong, like our president does. You listen to the doctor. We are space doctors for all kinds of projects. People don't have to know why. They have to ultimately, if they're sensitive, feel the difference. That's why we work so hard, is to find those things. If you're doing a project in Jordan, or you're doing a project in Georgia, or you're doing a project in Los Angeles, you have to feel the being of those places in order to be able to find resistance, not acceptance, but resistance to that.
Interesting. I'm going to go back to some of the theoretical parts, or to history a little bit. One of the interesting papers that we read during our days in the university. I'm a graduate. I've been out of university 2 years ago. So I was looking into one of the papers. It's called "The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa" by Colin Roy, and
Yes.
it's the first time that we've been introduced to how to analyze a building by looking at the ordering system, the difference between the Palladian ordering system and the one that Le Corbusier showed us. So I was looking into that and thinking, when it comes to looking into new architecture to create analytical point of view. If I want to look at my past, at the past that we have in Jordan or in any Arab country, so I can understand more of the ideal buildings that we have already existing in our culture. We have the old Syrian houses that had a court inside, similar stuff in Egypt, Lebanon, somewhere. So what are the tools that I should be using to look at these buildings to get eventually to the one question that Colin Roy told you to do? Look at it for 2 hours and then you don't see. So what should
you have it's a very look. Having taught for 50 years, teaching is really difficult. You know, there's no one way to think. In Palladio, for example, there may be 20 different grid organizations. What you have to be able to do, I believe, what I would suggest doing and what people have done, for example, in Iran, which is different. It's a different culture than the Saudi Peninsula, let's say, the Persian idea. But the idea of the organization of spaces is very different, let's say, than the organization of spaces in a place like Iraq or Lebanon, or I would imagine Jordan. I can't speak. But I would imagine that if you took a look carefully at what was Iran and what was Jordan, you begin to understand what those characteristics were that were indigenous to being to understanding Jordanese culture, or Jordanian, I should say.
Thank you. I think I got it. Thank you.
I'm not saying that it takes time. It's taken me 50 years to be able to talk to you. So, you know, it's not an easy thing.
Yes, we need to be devoted for it, I guess. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
There is a question about most of deconstruction projects are found in wealthy nations. Are these projects limited to the wealthy countries? And will we see this kind of project in countries with limited sources?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. First of all, deconstruction is dead. It died a natural death. I don't think it was applicable necessarily for architecture. What I'm saying, though, is what has replaced it is crazier than deconstruction. I mean, what you see going on today, and I don't want to name names, but they're all over. They're in Egypt, they're in Jordan, they're everywhere, okay? And the computer has turned into a crazy monster, produces things that are much crazier than deconstruction. I think there has to be an idea of resistance without craziness, okay? You don't have to produce craziness to be culturally resistant. That's why I go back to Alberti, who is really exciting when you get down and analyze Alberti, what he was doing and what he was saying. And the same thing goes for architects in Japan, architects in China. If you go to China, which I did recently, and look at their gardens, they're not like Persian gardens, they're not like Middle Eastern gardens, they're not like British gardens or French gardens. The garden form is a very telling form and a way of studying space, because the organization of gardens has usually been very much a local phenomenon. Is it possible to make a garden today that is of a certain resistant quality and yet is affordable? That's the whole thing. Can we do these things? We made the budget on the project in Milan, and I think that it's important to be cognizant of these things. So, yes, decon is a difficult architecture. That's why it didn't go. What I see today, the vestiges of digital 2 or digital 3 are even stranger. So architecture is not in a good point right now in the West, I would say. What we need to do is to get control. Look, the digital platforms like Rhino don't really, they have a style. They don't have a national style. They don't know. They're mute when it comes to what to do in Jordan or Iran or Georgia, etc. They don't know. It's the same thing. The students take those same images and roll them around in front of their desk because they're Rhino images. So Rhino is the new international language of architecture. That's what we have to change. We cannot be doing computer platforms like Rhino and saying that they are indigenous. They're not.
Okay.
Actually, we have a similar problem here. Actually, in Jordan, in our education, that most of the students are using Revit. Everything is trying to be a BIM model, and they just use what's existing in the model, whatever it is, and having this weird image of something already done. So it kind of took out the soul of the architecture and the poetry of design that should be in it, in my point of view.
Look, I see it all the time as well. I mean, the students want to do crazy things. I don't think my feeling is that if we study precedent and make sure that the student studies precedent, they would change over time. I can't predict. Right now, I can't teach contemporary architecture. I teach Alberti, I teach Palladio, I teach Borromini. I think it's important to understand those kinds of things. What the equivalent would be in the Middle East, I don't know what that is. But I think part of it has to do with Persia and the Persian Empire. I think it had an effect in the Arabian Peninsula as well. I haven't studied that, but you guys should know the difference between an Arabian garden and a Persian garden. You've got to know the difference between the organization of space in those kinds of places. And that's what you got to teach the students and see if they can come up with something. It's time. I don't have the answers. I just tell you what I was doing. I showed you. I think that there is a lot of room for a lot of young people, especially now with the pandemic. We realize that there are other problems beside the virus. There are environmental problems. There are sustainability problems. There are problems of environment that are really complex. And our students can't leave architecture and just study environmental complexity. They first, if they're going to solve environmental problems, need to be architects. That to me comes above all other. And as a human being, you can be interested in environmental problems. But how do I make today a Jordanian environment that is sustainable as opposed to an Iranian one, as opposed to a Georgian one, as opposed to an Italian one? How do I do that? That's the key to producing a resistant architecture today.
Okay. I want to ask the last question for me, and then maybe we can move to the audience questions regarding to the student. You mentioned that the architect does not solve the problems, people's problem, because they are not psychologists or economists. We can stop. Can we stop here and explain
We can only solve architectural problems. We can teach students not to solve economic, social, political. We've got to entertain those problems, but we have to do it with architecture, not with economics, because we don't know economic models.
But can the architecture somehow contribute to solve society problems?
It's not self-sufficient on its own. No, it cannot do it by itself. I don't know how to solve the problem of carbon form, for example. That's a big problem. I'm working on it with my students. We said it in a studio exercise, but I don't know what the answer is. For sure.
Okay.
The best thing you can do today, honestly, as a young architect, ask questions. Don't provide answers, ask the right questions. And finding out what those are is really, really important.
I think we need to take a selection of what our audience has asked. There is about 2,000 questions. Yeah, there's a lot of.
Do you have any questions from the audience?
Yeah. There's a question said, you mentioned that you do not really appreciate or enjoy the Scandinavian approach to phenomenology. However, you mentioned phenomenology as phenomenology in your text. Can you explain to us what do you means to you, and how you apply it in your projects?
I believe phenomenology, Dan, deals essentially with the substance of things, the being of thingness, and from Alberti on, and you have to understand why I'm interested in Alberti. Alberti is the first writer in architecture to use the term space, okay? Everything else was a column, wall, roof, etc., never space. Space is anti-phenomena. It is another kind of phenomena. Phenomenology deals with the physical object, not the space between those things. I'm interested in the space between the physical, and therefore I have a problem with the phenomenology branch of architecture. I'm not going to mention names, but that's one of the interesting things. Can we deal with space? That is the absence of physical being. And how do we do that today? There's a big difference between phenomenology and, let's say, spatial organization, or the organization of absence. And contemporary philosophy is all about the organization of absence. And so that's something I think is international. It's not Jordanian or Arabian, it's international. You're either interested in phenomena or you're interested in absence. And the two will never come together.
Okay. Another question, maybe Ray can ask.
Okay. Actually, we got a lot of questions from the people here watching us, and I want to ask you one of the questions, or most of the questions were about the digital world and how artificial intelligence is going to. The question, it came directly like that. So, do you think that AI, artificial intelligence, will ever take over the role of architects? Yes or no, and why?
Look, look, when we started doing architecture in 1982, let's say, big scale architecture, when I moved from doing houses to big scale architecture, I needed to find a platform that could model surfaces, physical things, not absences, but physical things. And there was a professor at Ohio State who was working with a platform called Form Z, which was a very primitive platform. Greg Lynn talks all about it in his Archaeology of the Digital. Really an important book to read. And what we were doing, Greg was working for me. We were taking computer images from Form Z and drawing over them and sending them back so he could model our drawings, because we had no way of going from a flat surface to a double curved surface or whatever, different kinds of surface modeling. And so the early forms were not Peter Eisenman or Greg Lynn, they were Form Z. And slowly, we were able to transition from Form Z to other platforms. What we have to be careful of is what I was saying in my lecture. We have to be careful that these platforms don't overcome and take architecture, and we assume that we're doing architecture. We're doing the bidding of Rhino or 3D Studio or any of those current platforms. And we have to be careful that we're doing architecture. So AI, while important, is also a difficulty. I think still, I want my students to learn how to draw. Drawing is still a fundamental act of being an architect. And you can't have the computer draw for you. You have to learn to draw. And then you can use the computer, I think. I think you need to add or subtract before you can do quantum equations. And there's no substitute for adding and subtracting. The same thing, there's no substitute for drawing. Learn how to draw, then use those platforms. Or in another sense, invent your own algorithms. That's what we ultimately are going to need to do, is learn how to manufacture and conceptualize algorithms of our own.
Okay, there's another question. I think it's deep philosophy. In one of your talks, you said if you have a datum that is ground zero, you are going to being as a data with homogeneous space, because a datum require homogeneous to be a data. You start then in projecting these down into the ground and projecting things up to the ground. So that sectional movement between level makes it heterogeneous. Can you explain more to us about the relationship between homogeneous and heterogeneous space in a small scale and larger scale projects?
Oh, that's a tough question. Look, when Alberti conceived of space, he was conceiving of homogeneous space, okay? Well, the first conception was that everything is the same. Gradually, when you move from Alberti and Bramante through to Borromini, we start to get heterogeneous space. That some spaces that are dense, some spaces that are not dense, some spaces that are complex, some that are not. And if you go into, let's say, Carlo Rinaldi's church, Santa Maria in Compitelli in Rome, everybody should go see Santa Maria in Compitelli. There are different scales, but different densities of space, way beyond the kind of homogeneous space that Alberti was thinking about. I would argue that Mies van der Rohe does homogeneous space, Corbusier does heterogeneous space. It's not one or the other. They're two different kinds of space. Most of my projects have a different kind of organization between, it uses both homogeneous and heterogeneous. Now, to the question of scale, I cannot answer because I don't know what happens to the differentiation between homogeneous and heterogeneous at a larger scale. I haven't done that. I'm always reverting back to a smaller scale because ultimately we're at the scale of the human being. Whether that's a sufficient answer or not, no. But I think the question, whoever it was, to say, what is the difference when you get in scale between homogeneous and heterogeneous space? That's a really good question. I can't answer it.
Thank you. We have actually another question that kept going on repetitively from the audience. Most of the people want to know, is architecture going to change after COVID-19? I've heard your answer in one of the interviews recently, actually, but the people here want to know your point of view.
On what is the question?
What is going architecture to be after the COVID-19? After the pandemic? Is it going to affect?
Okay. Yeah. Look, there are always going to be viruses and plagues, and there have been in the history. If you look, there are plagues all the time. They're not the cause for architecture necessarily to change. Even though I've studied a lot of history, I can't say that the Black Death caused the change between Renaissance and Baroque, let's say. While I think it's time for change, and the virus points that out to us, I don't think it suggests what kind of change. I don't think there's any relation between the change that will happen naturally with the evolution of the virus. I don't think so. I have lived through. I was born in a depression, a great depression of ¡29. Mm-hmm. I lived through that. I lived through the HIV. I lived through Ebola. All of these things. So there've been and look, the people in the laboratories all through the world were telling the political leaders last year, before any idea of coronavirus, that there's coming a pandemic. No one listened. And that's what happened. And these things are coming. It'll be solved. And in another 25 years, there'll be another one, or 50 years, or 100 years. And we need to be more prepared. Whether that has to do with architecture or not, I haven't got that answer. I don't think so, because if I look at past history, that hasn't been the case. I don't think we can live less densely. I don't think we can live isolated either, like I'm doing right now. I don't go out of my house because I'm susceptible to, I could gone in a minute. But I think we have to be responsive to these things. I don't know how we're going to change architecture because of the coronavirus. I can't answer that. I don't think so. I think architecture will change for environmental reasons other than the virus. The question of carbon form, the question of sustainability are all pre-COVID.
Okay, I think I will ask you the last question before we end this interesting lecture. The question is, what is the most essential steps an architect should take after graduation?
What is the most interesting what?
What's the most essential steps an architect should take after graduation?
Oh, gosh. Look, I think that it's important to get experience in real building, to go into an office where there's real production, number one. for a few years. I think it's a good thing to go to an office in another culture, like go to Germany, go to France, go to Japan, go to China. There's so many interesting places to work because putting buildings together is the same no matter where you are, just the language has changed. But then I would try as a young architect to get into teaching, because the only way you can get out from under working from somebody else is to teach. You're not going to get buildings that sustain your life to be able to do that. So in order to break away from working for X, Y, and Z, it would be a good idea to get a teaching job. And, you know, it's getting more and more difficult to get a teaching job, let's say, in China or Japan or the United States. It really is. It's very difficult for my students, many of whom are not American. I have at least a third to a half of my students are not indigenous American. But I would say you gotta work and you gotta keep growing and thinking. Don't have to design so much. You can grow up when you're 30, you can start 35. It's like you don't necessarily want to get married at 20. Better to get married at 35 when you understand what's at stake than to get married too young. The same thing with designing. Wait, everybody gets their chance if they're patient. There's always another generation of people. You people will all get your chance. Get ready. That's all I would say.
Okay.
We'll work our best.
We have one more question, and this will be the last one. Please.
Yes. First of all, people wanted to know about the book that you mentioned during the lecture. The one from Mario, from Alphabet. We didn't get the full name of the book.
Algorithm. It's the book by Mario Carpo, Carpo, From Alphabet to Algorithm.
From Alphabet to Algorithm.
Algorithm, and the second book is The Second Digital Turn.
To Algorithm.
They're really, really good books.
All right, then. All right. Okay, we got to the
I have a new book. If they want to know, I can show you. It's called Lateness. It's just out, and it's what Peter Eisenman thinks today. You'd have to get it from Amazon. It's a pre-order from Amazon, but I think it's a small book, but worthwhile.
I hope one day I have the ability to buy it and come take an autograph from you directly. It will be my pleasure.
Me too. Thank you very much, you guys. Great questions, great audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Yazan want to say something, I guess.
Heard him?
In the end, we would like to thank you, Mr. Peter Eisenman, for this time. We really appreciate your time and effort to be with us there. And we were very good for us to see a new point of view and a new perspective from someone who is very experienced in this field. We are pretty sure that this experience will broaden our thinking and understanding of architecture. So thank you again.
Thank you. Someday we get together in Amman.
I hope so. We're coming to you here. Waiting for you.
Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks for everyone for being with us here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Thanks for everyone.
Yeah.
We have more than 2,000 people. They are watching us now, and we hope keep in touch for more events.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good night. Thank you, Mr.
And thank you, everyone, for all the efforts to make this happen. Everyone,
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.